Permanent neutrality of the Korean Peninsula. Is it possible? Or is it a dream? 4. North Korea denuclearization scenarios. Making the miracle on the Taedong River. North Korean Workers' Party can give up nuclear weapons. The model of four-state guarantees permanent neutralization of North and South Korea, UN Security Council enforcement, is, in fact, the most ideal and perfect scenario that has been studied countless times by academia and politics to resolve the division and nuclear issues, starting from Yu Gil-jun's theory of neutralization in the late Joseon Dynasty and continuing to the present day. It is also the method by which Switzerland and Austria in Europe survived through turbulent history. To state the conclusion first, this plan faces a dilemma. Theoretically, it is a perfect answer, but within the dynamics of real-world international politics, its feasibility is extremely slim. I will coolly examine the reasons why this excellent idea encounters real-world barriers, focusing on the cost-benefit calculations of neighboring countries and military perspectives. 1. The reason North Korea rejects permanent neutralization is that it amounts to nothing more than security on a piece of paper. There is almost no possibility that the Kim Jong-un regime in North Korea will accept international legal security guarantees neutralization in exchange for abandoning nuclear weapons. This is because within North Korea's perception structure, international legal mechanisms such as treaties signed by great powers or UN documents are nothing more than pieces of paper that can be torn up at any time if the other party so desires. The case of the 1994 Budapest Memorandum of Understanding with Ukraine illustrates this. Ukraine abandoned its entire nuclear arsenal, the world's third largest, trusting in an international agreement that promised territorial integrity and sovereignty guarantees from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Russia. However, Russia violated this agreement and launched invasions in 2014 and 2022. Observing this, North Korea learned that this is the end of those who give up nuclear weapons in exchange for international guarantees. Looking at the end of Libya's Gaddafi 2003, Libya also abandoned its nuclear program in trust of U.S. economic and security guarantees, but its regime eventually collapsed at the hands of Western-backed rebels. For Kim Jong-un, the nuclear button, which he can pull the trigger on at any time, is a far more certain security guarantee than the status of a neutral state guaranteed by the four nations and the UN. The differing perspectives on the concept of a neutral state, stemming from the conflicting dreams of the United States and China, are causing instability. Becoming a permanently neutral Korean peninsula means that no foreign troops can be stationed in either North or South Korea, nor can any specific military alliance be joined. This is where a fatal clash of interests arises between the U.S. and China. From the U.S. perspective, the risk of withdrawing U.S. troops from South Korea is too great. For the U.S., the neutralization of the Korean Peninsula implies the withdrawal of U.S. troops and the abrogation of the ROK-U.S. Mutual Defense Treaty. This would mean the loss of the core of the containment network against China, the most frontline base for containing China in the Asia-Pacific region. It is highly unlikely that the U.S. would abandon its hegemonic strategy for the entire Northeast Asia just to secure North Korean denuclearization. Even from China's perspective, there are doubts regarding genuine neutrality. China would likely welcome the neutralization of the Korean Peninsula and the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. However, there is deep distrust regarding the question. Even if South Korea, which has been a blood ally of the United States for decades, merges with nuclear-armed North Korea to become a neutral state, will it really abandon its pro-American stance and maintain perfect neutrality? The reality of 2026 is that the enforceability of the UN Security Council could be neutralized. If necessary, involve the UN Security Council to increase enforceability, The key link in this idea is the unity of the Security Council's permanent members, the US, China, Russia, the UK, and France. However, the current UN Security Council is completely paralyzed. Due to Russia's invasion of Ukraine and the hegemonic rivalry between the US and China, the Security Council has lost its proper function through the indiscriminate use of veto powers. The cold reality of the international community in 2026 is that even if North Korea fires a missile, China and Russia exercise their vetoes, preventing the adoption of even a single statement. In this situation, it is close to a miracle for the US, China, and Russia to gather and reach an agreement to impose joint military sanctions exercise coercion if North Korea violates denuclearization. If North Korea violates the Neutrality Treaty and secretly redevelops nuclear weapons, and China or Russia exercises their veto power based on their own interests, the enforceability under international law will immediately become a scrap of paper. These are the conditions for neutralization viewed through historical examples. Historically, countries that have been recognized and maintained the status of permanent neutrality shared common conditions. Switzerland was a natural fortress surrounded by massive mountainous terrain on all sides, and it possessed a strong capacity for armed neutrality with its entire population armed. In 1955, during the early stages of the US-Soviet Cold War, Austria was dramatically settled based on the Swiss model through a strategic agreement. If neither side could possess Austria, they would rather leave it empty as a buffer zone that no one would own. However, the Korean Peninsula is a geopolitical hub where the interests of the world's most powerful nations, the US, China, Russia, and Japan, clash head-on. As long as surrounding great powers compete to bring the Korean Peninsula under their own influence, such as pro-US or pro-China blocs, rather than leaving it as an empty buffer zone, structural neutralization is difficult to achieve. Nevertheless, this idea holds value. At this point, the likelihood of a big deal for permanent neutralization being realized is very low. This is because North Korea has no intention of giving up its nuclear weapons, and the US, China, and Russia lack the trust to compromise regarding the Korean Peninsula. Nevertheless, this proposal holds significant meaning. This is because if a decisive turning point arrives, such as a future regime collapse or a dramatic grand compromise between the US and China, this model of permanent neutralization and multilateral security guarantees is the only exit strategy and ultimate destination capable of preventing an all-out war on the Korean Peninsula and reassuring neighboring countries. Although it is difficult to use right now, it is essentially the last resort that must be kept in a drawer for the great turning point that will eventually come. This idea is not new. Rather, it is the oldest and most repeatedly proposed solution. The key lesson is that neutralization works only when the interests of all relevant countries converge. Furthermore, the case of Ukraine has proven that security guarantees are nothing more than scraps of paper without military enforcement capabilities. Let us examine the interests of each country. What the United States gains includes the elimination of North Korea's nuclear program, such as the disappearance of ICBM threats, the removal of conflict risks on the Korean Peninsula, and securing the capacity to reorganize the front against China. What the United States loses includes the withdrawal of U.S. forces. Korea foreign troops cannot be stationed in a neutral country, the loss of forward bases in East Asia, the dissolution of the ROK-US alliance, and the disappearance of key strategic strongholds for the Indo-Pacific strategy. From the U.S. perspective, U.S. forces Korea are not merely for the defense of South Korea. They are key strategic strongholds for containing China, defending Japan, and projecting power in the Western Pacific. It is highly unclear whether a deal to obtain the elimination of North Korea's nuclear program in exchange for giving up these forces is advantageous to the United States. in particular voluntarily abandoning forward bases at a time when China is rising conflicts with the fundamentals of U.S. military strategy. What China gains includes the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea, a long-cherished goal for decades, the blocking of U.S. influence through the neutralization of the Korean Peninsula, the isolation of Japan, and the maintenance of a buffer zone over North Korea, existing as a neutral state even after denuclearization. What China loses is the strategic leverage card of North Korea and exclusive influence over the Korean Peninsula. From China's perspective, it is the country with the greatest benefit among the four major powers. The withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea is something China has been demanding for decades. With North Korea's denuclearization, the pretext for Japan and South Korea to arm themselves with nuclear weapons also disappears. China has the greatest incentive to participate most actively in this framework. What Russia gains is the stabilization of the security environment in the Far East, the reaffirmation of its status as a great power through engagement in Korean Peninsula issues, and leverage in negotiations for sanctions relief. What Russia loses is current military and economic cooperation with North Korea, a supply route for war materials, and substantial support for North Korea during the war in Ukraine. From Russia's perspective, as long as the war in Ukraine continues, there is no reason to abandon cooperation with North Korea. The possibility of participation opens up after the war ends. What Japan gains is the elimination of the North Korean nuclear threat and the stabilization of the Korean Peninsula. What Japan loses is the security buffer provided by the U.S. forces Korea, a base for U.S. intervention in the event of a contingency on the Korean Peninsula, and a reduction in the strategic depth of the U.S.-Japan alliance. From Japan's perspective, it is difficult to support this on the surface. The withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea would be a direct blow to Japan's security as well. If China strengthens its influence over the Korean Peninsula following its neutralization, Japan will become even more isolated. What North Korea gains is the perpetuation of the Kim Dynasty through regime guarantees from the four major powers and the UN, opportunities for economic openness, and security guarantees without nuclear weapons. What North Korea loses are nuclear weapons, its only regime insurance, and the opportunity to break free from dependence on China. From North Korea's perspective, having vividly witnessed the failure of the Budapest Memorandum on Ukraine, Kim Jong-un harbors a fundamental distrust regarding whether security guarantees can actually replace nuclear deterrence. North Korea knows that a guarantee without enforcement power is not a guarantee at all. What South Korea gains is the elimination of the North Korean nuclear threat, a permanent reduction in war risks, and the formation of a structure for the possibility of unification. What South Korea loses is the dissolution of the U.S.-South Korea alliance, limitations on independent security capabilities. Neutral nations are subject to arms limits, restrictions on economic and diplomatic autonomy, and a structure in which its fate is effectively determined by the consensus of major powers. Let us examine the enforcement capability, which is the most significant structural problem with this plan. Analyzing the reasons for the success of Austria's neutralization reveals a stark contrast with the situation on the Korean Peninsula. In terms of geopolitical location, Austria is situated in the heart of Europe, and served as a buffer zone advantageous to both sides, whereas the Korean Peninsula is the front line of the U.S.-China rivalry for hegemony. Regarding the interests of the parties involved, both sides benefited in Austria, the Soviet Union, by containing German rearmament, and the West by limiting Soviet influence, whereas on the Korean Peninsula, the benefits for the United States are unclear, such as the loss of forward bases. Looking at the enforcement mechanism, the Cold War structure itself served as a deterrent for Austria, whereas the Korean Peninsula is currently facing a situation of severe internal conflict among the permanent members of the UN Security Council. The nature of the threats is also fundamentally different. Austria faced conventional threats, whereas the Korean Peninsula involves nuclear weapons. In terms of economic self-reliance, Austria possessed sufficient economic capacity, whereas North Korea is in a state of economic collapse. Let us examine the limitations of the UN Security Council. While it is necessary to grant legal enforceability through the UN Security Council, there is a core issue. The enforcement mechanism for violations of UN Security Council resolutions requires resolutions for military sanctions. However, enforcement becomes impossible if China or Russia exercises its veto power. If China vetoes military sanctions when North Korea violates an agreement, the Security Council becomes ineffective. This is theoretical enforceability, not actual enforcement power. The fact that the UN Security Council was unable to do anything when Ukraine was invaded serves as a precise precedent. 3. Let us look at the necessary conditions for this plan to work. To make it theoretically possible, the following conditions must be met simultaneously. It is an enforceable multilateral security mechanism. Actual military enforcement is required, not just guarantees on paper. A feasible model involves the participation of 4 major powers to station a multinational peacekeeping force on the Korean Peninsula based on a separate treaty, rather than as part of UNPKO. A special provision exempting the veto power would be created to establish a mechanism for automatic sanctions in the event of North Korea's violations, and nuclear inspectors would be permanently stationed in North Korea. However, the special provision exempting the veto power requires an amendment to the UN Charter, which is realistically impossible. Acceptance of the strategic redeployment of the United States. It must be acceptable to reorganize the U.S. East Asia strategy based on Japan, Guam, and Australia following the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea. This constitutes a fundamental redesign of U.S. military strategy and requires the consent of Congress and the military. This concerns North Korea's verifiable denuclearization. The chicken and egg problem, whether to abandon nuclear weapons before receiving security guarantees or to receive security guarantees after abandoning nuclear weapons, must be resolved. Let us look at a possible sequence. In Step 1, North Korea concludes a 4-power security treaty while possessing nuclear weapons. In Step 2, economic assistance and diplomatic normalization begin. In Step 3, phased denuclearization and verification proceed simultaneously. In Step 4, the status of a neutral state is fully activated after the completion of complete denuclearization. Consent of the South Korean people is required. Neutralization effectively means the dissolution of the U.S.-South Korea alliance. As a democratic nation, South Korea requires national consensus on whether the South Korean people can trust the guarantees of 4 powers while abandoning the security system they have relied on for 70 years. Looking at the most realistic path, while a complete 4-power neutralization treaty is impossible in the short term, a partial and phased approach is feasible. 4. Assessment of realistic phased possibilities. Phase 1 involves the conclusion of a North Korea-U.S. peace agreement and a non-aggression declaration, which is possible. Phase 2 involves a non-legally binding security declaration by the 4 surrounding powers, which is difficult. Phase 3 involves granting legal status through a UN Security Council resolution, which is extremely difficult. Phase 4 involves the withdrawal of U.S. forces Korea and complete neutralization, which is nearly impossible. 5. Let us examine the true value of this proposal. Despite its low feasibility, there are reasons why this proposal is important. First, it expands the negotiation framework. Currently, North Korean nuclear negotiations are confined within a narrow framework of denuclearization versus economic compensation. The neutralization plan expands this framework to the geopolitical restructuring of the entire Korean Peninsula. If this big picture is brought to the negotiating table, the range of what each country can offer and receive will broaden. Second, it is the only card that can truly move China. What China genuinely desires is the withdrawal of U.S. troops from South Korea. Only by placing this on the negotiating table will China genuinely cooperate with North Korea's denuclearization. One of the reasons all negotiations to date have failed is that the United States has not provided what China truly wants. This is my comprehensive assessment. While this plan is logically the most complete solution, it is also the one with the lowest feasibility within the current geopolitical landscape. There is only one scenario in which this plan becomes a reality. The moment comes when the U.S. and China reach an agreement in their competition for hegemony in East Asia that jointly managing the Korean Peninsula is better than fighting each other. We do not know when that moment will arrive. However, if the North Korean nuclear crisis worsens, pressure for nuclear armament intensifies for South Korea and Japan, and both the U.S. and China are exhausted, this plan could suddenly emerge as the most rational exit strategy. Korea's role is to diplomatically design and prepare this plan starting now. When a crisis strikes, the country with a prepared blueprint leads the negotiations. This is why Korea must become an active architect rather than a passive object. Next time, I will discuss a scenario for resolving denuclearization internally within North Korea, focusing on the perspective of the North Korean people, who are the parties suffering the most from North Korea's nuclear armament. Thank you.